Great panel on water conservation regulations. I'm going to call to the podium my friend Lance Gooden, who I serve on appropriations with. He is out of Terrell and Texas, and he's got a BBA in finance. He serves on appropriations and urban affairs or county. What other committee do you serve on?
County affairs.
County affairs, that's right. Representative Lyle Larson, Natural Resource Committee. He's a first-term state rep from San Antonio. He's got a BBA from A&M, served on the San Antonio City Council, Bexar County Commissioner. Welcome, Lyle. Blair Fitzsimons, Executive Director of the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. You just saw a great video. She's the founding Executive Director of that organization. She spearheaded the efforts to establish the purchase of development rights program in Texas. Welcome, Blair. Next panelist is Billy Howe, State Legislative Director for the Texas Farm Bureau. He's been with the Texas Farm Bureau since 1999, been their Executive Director or State Legislative Director since 2002. Has his BS in Political Science from Louisiana State University. That'd be a good university to have a BS from, right? Right, Billy? Okay. Okay. Russ Johnson, partner of McGinnis Lockridge and Kilgore. Russ represented the city of San Antonio's water system in litigation under the Endangered Species Act, challenging San Antonio's use of the Edwards groundwater. He advises clients concerning the use and disposal of water in connection with oil and gas hydrofracking operations. Welcome, Russ. We have Jason Skaggs, Executive Director, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. He has his BA in Agricultural Development from Texas A&M, master's degree in agribusiness from Mississippi State University. He's worked all kinds of places for Charlie Stenholm, Texas Senator Duncan. Welcome, Jason. And finally, Laurel Stepney, Deputy Director, TCEQ, Office of Water. She has her BA in Aerospace Engineering, my goodness, and master's degree in Environmental Engineering from UT Austin. She has a position of Division Director for the Water Quality Control. Welcome, Laurel. Okay. And by the way, each of you have presumably heard the discussion in the prior panels. If you disagree with some of the issues or positions taken, this would be a good opportunity now that you have the mic to give us your thoughts on that. But so let me start with I know my friend Lyle Larson. Lyle is taken an interest in groundwater districts throughout the state of Texas, and you've been on a tour of Texas, if you will. Lyle, bring us up to speed on where you are on that tour and what you found.
Well, being an Aggie, I guess I'm slower than most, so I need to go meet with folks and sit down and talk to them. We've hit 10 river authorities from the Canadian River and the Panhandle all the way over the Sabine River, and then the large groundwater districts and the large public utilities. And if you look at it from that perspective and use it in the context of the drought of 2011, the impacts were statewide. We lost over $7 billion in ag, but you saw also a stress in the communities, the large communities, and all of a sudden conservation is a meaningful word when it comes to dealing with watering people's yards versus having water to drink or to provide the industrial base enough water. So yeah, we still have a few down in South Texas to go hit, but I've really learned a lot, and the folks here in San Angelo, they've got very innovative approaches that they need some regulatory flexibility from TCEQ to resolve, and throughout, and going to Big Spring, the first direct reuse of effluent. And that's a new horizon because you've got to look at that water. It's put in those rivers, and whether you like it or not, if you're on a river, there's probably effluent from another community, and I think that they've done the right thing there. So it's been a learning experience.
Have you collected any thoughts on any sort of legislative initiatives in the 83rd session going forward?
There are. Obviously, each of the regions is unique. There's issues. There needs to be consistency in conservation. When you have one source of water, whether it be a river or a groundwater, and you've got multiple agencies that are governing over the same source of water, and in the drought of 2011, we had some folks that were in stage 3 in their conservation in an adjoining county. They weren't even activating their conservation measures, and they're using the same source of water. We've got to have uniformity, that when we are in a stressful period where we're not getting adequate rainfall, then everybody needs to come to the table and start using the same practices, the best water practices that we have. There's nothing in the state that governs over that. So I think that we need we've encouraged people. We've tried to get folks and reason with them that it's in the best interest of the whole to do that. But some of those things, and then there's some new technology out there, whether it be desalination or start storing water underground. That there's going to have to be enabling legislation to work out the issues with groundwater districts and other folks that'll be impacted.
Billy Howe, Farm Bureau, you represent a constituency that is very much a part of the fabric of Texas, and give us your perspective on the issues facing Farm Bureau and the folks that you represent, and weigh in on this issue of groundwater and balancing that with use in the energy sector. So give us your thoughts, if you will.
Well, I think balance is the right word. And Farm Bureau, we've got strong policy supporting local groundwater conservation districts, and we believe that they are the appropriate entities to regulate groundwater production in the state of Texas. And I often do hear concerns from Farm Bureau members about some of the exemptions to the groundwater district's regulations, particularly with regards to the oil and gas industry. I particularly heard it from Farm Bureau members when they developed the Barnett Shale up in that area. At that time, they had no groundwater districts at all. The priority groundwater management area hadn't been created for that area for them to create groundwater districts, and they created groundwater districts, and then they turned around, they were said, well, but we can't really regulate the groundwater that's being produced by the oil and gas companies. And so then they were calling me, won't know why. But I think it's going to be really interesting now that we have private ownership confirmed of groundwater, how that's going to affect the exemptions in Chapter 36, period. Because if those statutory exemptions prevent a landowner from being able to drill a well to basically get their fair share of the aquifer, whereas an exempt user gets to drill their well and produce large amounts of water, at what point do we end up seeing a challenge of that statute, saying that the statute, not the groundwater, but the statute creates a takings? And I don't know what the legal basis exactly would be with regards to that, but it is interesting. Because your property right is the right to drill a well and to produce groundwater without wasting it. And under the regulations of the groundwater district, who's trying to achieve the desired future conditions of the aquifer, but you've got a class of users out there that aren't operating under the same regulations that other landowners are having to operate under. And I think that's going to be, with regards to the whole energy issue, if you're talking about fracking and whatever, I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic that's going to have to work itself out.
Jason, cattle raisers, tell me what your perspective on that is.
Well, obviously, I mean, as I travel all across the state of Texas and other states as well across the country, we're facing a drought that we've never seen probably in the history of our state and maybe even in some parts of the country. And I think, obviously water is very much, both surface and groundwater, but both very much on the minds of landowners all over the state. And I think as we talk about groundwater specifically, one of our leaders once said early on in these discussions about groundwater is that the good thing is we have local control, and the bad thing is we have local control. And I think we've got a whole lot of other examples of that probably in this state and other areas, not just groundwater. But I think we certainly, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association certainly supports local control, certainly supports groundwater conservation districts. I think that the issue, particularly as it became on the ownership front, became really where we had many members that were in favor of creating these local groundwater conservation districts across the state. And when some of those, I emphasize the word some, underline, that when some of those districts took the position that they were not there any longer to help manage those rights for the benefit of everybody in the district, but that you no longer had a right. I think that's where there was really a rub with many landowners across the state, and began to raise this question on ownership. And that has obviously led into a number of other issues that I know have been talked about. The exemption issue is obviously one that's definitely come up. I think most landowners that you'll talk to, if not all of them, would tell you that you can't produce food and fiber without fuel, and you can't produce fuel without food and fiber. And the two go hand in hand, and we've got to figure out a way to make sure that particularly for the economy of our state, that we can continue to provide fuel for our state and also food for our state. And I think Commissioner Staples said it pretty well in the video that we certainly don't want to have to rely on foreign sources of food, much less foreign sources of fuel. And so this exemption issue will, I think, continue to come up. But I will tell you that landowners very much value and are very responsible with the exemption that they've been given, that the 25,000 gallon a day exemption for domestic and livestock production. That's very important. And we've also, I think, owe it to the energy sector to recognize their contribution to the economy, and we have to strike that balance. So I think when people are quick to point the finger at the oil and gas industry for an exemption, the old saying, look down at your hand, you got three fingers pointing back at you. I think that's we've got to be careful and really aware of what we're talking about and who we're pointing the finger at. So,
Russ, you're kind of nodding your head. You want to weigh in on these issues?
Sure. Obviously, I'm here for the Texas Wildlife Association, an organization that is dedicated and devoted to the idea of stewardship and conservation of our natural resources. And they've been very much involved in the water issue for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the concern that their conservation efforts would be in essence, the equivalent of abandoning or losing their water rights. And let me explain what I mean by that. You heard a little discussion about groundwater districts permitting based on historic use, which is kind of the exact opposite of encouraging conservation of groundwater resources. In essence, it rewards use of groundwater resources and punishes conservation of that resource. And that's not just true in groundwater, it's true in surface water as well. We talk a lot about conservation, we talk a lot about incentivizing conservation, but the truth is that under both surface and groundwater law and regulation, there are impediments to incentivizing conservation. In surface water law, if you don't use your right, you are subject to having it canceled or losing that right. So if you have a 1,000 acre-foot right and conserve through measures that you implement and are only using 500 acre-feet, in theory, you're in danger of losing that additional 500 acre-feet that you've conserved. And the same was true in groundwater. Groundwater districts were finding it easier to simply permit historic use and limit everyone else. So the organization fought hard for recognition of groundwater ownership as a means of incentivizing conservation and recognizing the conservation efforts of their membership. So I think we've started down the road of recognizing that we need to modify our approach. I think we still have a long way to go before we can say safely that we have truly incentivized conservation.
Thank you. Blair, we saw a wonderful video, and that presumably was done with your blessings and instruction. Please tell us about the land trust and, from your perspective, what are the advantages and how can you play a role in this water picture?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to show that video. It tells our story much more eloquently than I certainly can. The Texas Agricultural Land Trust was started by leaders from some of the groups that share the podium, the table here with me here today, who felt like landowners needed some incentives to continue the stewardship of private lands. We have 142 million acres of privately owned farms, ranches, and timberland in Texas, one of the highest percentages of private lands in the United States, of any other state. So any solution to our water problems and other natural resource problems have to involve private landowners. Yet those private landowners are under siege. We're losing our land at the fastest rate than any other state in the country. I think somebody in the video said that. For every, A&M has shown, there's a study out of A&M that shows that for every 1,000 people who move to Texas, we lose 260 acres, and we're supposedly gaining 1,000 people a day in Texas. So we're losing our land at a pretty fast rate. And a lot of that's due to state taxes, market pressures, drought, all the various pressures on private landowners. Plus, we're up against basically, this is preaching to the choir here, but we're up against an urbanizing population that doesn't understand what goes on private lands. So the long and short of it is we were created to provide yet another incentive or another tool to landowners, a voluntary conservation easement that they place on their property to permanently protect those natural resources. One of those, of course, is water. And in placing that conservation easement on their property, they voluntarily restrict any transfers off the property. That property is left, that water is left on the property for the benefit of that farm or ranch operation.
Thank you. Thank you. Representative Gooden, you serve on my Appropriations Committee. And
I do.
And a valued member for East Texas. And give us your view on the role of the legislature in this defining regulatory authority over these groundwater districts, river authorities. Just share with us your perspective of the legislature's role in this.
I'll do that. And I also wanted to kind of touch on some of the other things people on this panel have said. Representative Larson talked about the need for there to be uniformity among conservation efforts across the state. And one example that I've seen in my district, I have the two counties immediately east of Dallas. And it's an interesting district because as soon as you cross the Dallas County line into my district, you don't really realize that you're no longer in Dallas County. There are houses everywhere. It's very suburban. And then the further you go, the more expansive the land is, and you feel like you're at times in San Angelo, out between San Angelo and Abilene, like my drive yesterday. And so I have different groups of people, and there's an urbanization effect in that people are coming out of Dallas into my district. Residential areas are being built overnight. Thousands of houses will pop up in 6 months to a year. And so there are water planning requirements with that. But then we've also got rural landowners who feel like they're losing their property and are having water issues. They can't afford to feed their animals. The same issues you have here in West Texas. But we also have a lake in the center of my district. It's called Cedar Creek Lake Reservoir. And it is one of the main sources to the Tarrant County Water District. So it's interesting because it's a lake far away from Fort Worth, but they can basically empty the lake at any point in time. And one of the questions that I got during the drought that was more severe last summer for my part of the state was, why aren't we expanding this lake? Why aren't we cleaning this lake out? Why aren't we doing more while we can actually get to the lake? And I read that yesterday in the San Angelo newspaper that they were saying we should be doing the same thing. So I often find that people have good ideas, but everyone's just sitting around saying, well, who should be doing this? Should the legislature be doing this? And I think that's something that'll come up in the next session. because the last 2 years of drought have taught us that if we don't do anything, then nothing gets done. And there's a lot of head scratching and a lack of action that I think the legislature is more inclined to address in the next session. And another thing I think that's important is the appetite of the people of Texas. Water, when I got into the legislature and first ran 2 years ago, water was not an issue that came up in my first campaign. Water's not something that people were talking about where I live. And it's now something that I get questions about everywhere I go. Water is an important issue. People are concerned. More people are talking about it. In November of this past year, we had the constitutional elections. And I think many of you may remember there was a ballot measure that allowed for the issuing of bonds to help us with water over the long term. And it was at a time when the Tea Party members of the Tea Party were campaigning against it. The federal government was continuing to be very pro-debt friendly, and there's kind of a negative connotation that surrounds debt and any talk of debt. So debt's bad. We don't want to raise debt in any form or fashion. And it was a very close election. It just barely passed, but the voters of Texas approved it. And I think that's a testament to the will of the people to do something about water, that they're willing to do what's right, even if it's not popular politically. And the voters approved that measure. And I think that's important because going into the next legislative session, the voters are wanting action from the legislature. And something that seems so simple, the same goes for schools. Do we fund schools or do we build prisons? Do we wait for the water problems in our state to get worse and they be more expensive down the road, or do we spend the money today and potentially save over the long term? And I think that's something we'll take up in appropriations with Representative Darby's leadership. He's the chairman of my subcommittee on appropriations, and I know that we're discussing that now. How much are the members of the legislature willing to put forward in spending for water? Because if we're in a tight budget scenario, then it's not necessarily easy to find $1 billion to spend on water. But I think that's a discussion that's going to be had this next session. Do we spend the money? Do we use rainy day funds for that? Is that considered a one-time expenditure that would be popular and supported by the governor? Or is that something that would be used to out of general revenue? So I think these are issues that we'll talk about. Money is always a factor, and I think from an appropriation standpoint, we'll be having more of a discussion about funding for the water plan than we've had in the past.
Thank you, Lance. And we're going to, a panel this afternoon, we're going to talk about the Water Development Board and some of that bonding issue. So for those of you in the audience, there'll be a panel talking about how we fund this. L'Oreal, you saving the best for last here. TCEQ, what an important role TCEQ plays in our total water picture. Start you out with just to kind of focus, narrow down on our Concho Water Master program. We have one of two programs in the state, and just touch a little bit about our own Water Master plan here on the Concho River Basin.
Sure. We thank you, first of all, Representative Darby and Senator Duncan, for the invitation to come and share with you some of the roles and responsibilities of the TCEQ. Yes, we have a number of water master programs in the state on the Rio Grande, South Texas, and the Concho River Basin. We have a new water master in the Concho. His name is Steve Ramos. And
is he here? Is Steve here?
I don't believe Steve is here today, but we do have a number of our regional staff members here, and they're on the back row, and I'll have them wave. They're from our San Antonio and also our San Angelo regional office, and so we're excited to be here today. But we do have the water master and his deputies who monitor the activities in the Concho and make adjustments or curtailments that as are needed, as depending on the conditions and the stream flow conditions. Unfortunately, West Texas hasn't seen as much rain as some of the other parts of the state, and actually the 2011 drought is still ongoing. I mean, we meet every 2 weeks to talk about the drought and what we're seeing, and particularly in the Concho area and as well as the other parts of West Texas. The stream flow is pretty low, the lake levels are pretty low, and so we're having to work with the communities on their water resource needs, the public water systems, the irrigators, and also the industry members. And our water master staff is heavily focused on that, seeing if we can stretch the water out as much as possible with the limited resources that we do have.
You know, I'm going to skip a little bit. We have a panel this afternoon. John Grant with CMRWD, of course, they're started an effluence treatment facility in Big Spring. I know there's an issue right now in Brownwood about getting permitted for their use of effluents. You know, that's always been, in my opinion, a very, very important part of the piece of the puzzle, if you will, is the ability of municipalities to treat their effluents and reintroduce that into their water supply. And yet, apparently we're running into a stump, if you will, about some of the pharmaceuticals in the water supply that we have issues.
Sure.
Would you comment on that, and let's see where we are on that?
One of the things that we learned in the last couple of droughts that we have is that we have to have creative solutions in order to supplement our water supplies. And so we have seen a number of communities, you mentioned Brownwood as an example, that are wanting to reuse wastewater, treated effluent. Now, we've been authorizing those, the reuse of wastewater for a number of years, but before, it was typically used for a city may want to reuse their wastewater to send it to their industrial customers or to water golf courses or football fields or that sort of thing, maybe even some of the non-edible crops. But what we've seen as of late, as a result of the drought, folks want to reuse the water to supplement their drinking water supplies, want to reuse wastewater for fracking operations. It's really become a significant potential source of additional water. And we are working closely with entities to process those applications as quickly as possible, especially we have a number of facilities or municipalities that are on our high priority list that have less than 180 days worth of water left. And so those are some of the things that we want to work closely with those communities to do. And, you know, we're happy to look at any reuse application. I know San Antonio has used it extensively, as well as some of the other communities.
Well, I mean, I guess my question is, do you see this as an issue that we can overcome and move beyond so that will allow these communities to deal with their water needs right now in this drought? Or do you see that as an obstacle that we're going to have to get clearance through the EPA? And talk a little bit about that connectivity.
I think it's an issue that we can overcome, and Brownwood is probably our first test case, and we're working closely with them, working through some of the technical issues. But the technology is there, which is the first step, and I think it's something that we'll be able to overcome. On a number of these issues, EPA kind of takes a back seat, and our agency is the lead on some of the drinking water issues. But if there are problems with EPA, we are absolutely willing to take that on.
You're on our corner, right?
We are.
Okay, good.
We're on first base.
You got that down, don't you? Okay.
So
Lyle, you're nodding your head. I know you've got experience in that.
Well, yeah, microfiltration, membrane technology is what they're using in Big Spring. They're doing it all over the country. So to take it to a potable standard, it's not real complex, and it should be allowed. It's being introduced into the rivers and the beds, the banks, the legislation that drives that. So they're just chlorinating it when it comes back out. So I don't think it's a big issue, but it's important because of those pharmaceuticals. But to go back to a point that Billy talked about and Blair talked about, we're in San Angelo, Texas, and you look at the legislature and the composition of the legislature. In 2010, when we redistrict, we've got districts in West Texas that have grown to 22, 23 counties. Senator Duncan, I believe, has 51 counties. And the urbanization has happened in the legislature too. It's no longer a rural dominant legislature. So when you come into committee hearings, people are talking, whether it be the electric companies, the oil companies, they always turn and and there's always the same slide that will show, well, ag uses 60 to 70% of the water, whether you're in a urban setting where it's going to be a lot less, but in a rural setting, there's counties that, it's all ag. And now you got the oil companies coming in, and they're going to use 6 or 7% of that water. But the policy making is going to be driven by the urban folks. And so it's imperative that people like Billy and Jason from the cattle raisers gets into the legislature and starts explaining that it's not about moving the water from the rural areas into the urban areas. It's about balancing it, because if you take it from the rural areas, you're going to have a cost increase in your food. I think last Thanksgiving, over the prior Thanksgiving, your cost was 13% higher for the same food. And I guess that's where my biggest concern is, from a legislative standpoint, that we no longer will have that influence. The Ag Committee, when they stand up and speak, not very many people listen. It has no impact on, the folks that they represent. And so we've got to go through a very deliberate process about educating people not only about the oil field, but also about the ag interest. 20 acres of spinach in the Eagle Ford, right south of San Antonio, is to go ahead and irrigate that through the season. It's equivalent to one hydraulic fracking job. You look at the economic benefit of the hydraulic fracking, and the benefit on the front end is about $2.3 million. That 20 acres of spinach is about $5,000. And so you've got to balance it. You can't look at the economics. That guy that owns that farm is entitled to that water, to those folks that are drilling that oil well. And then you go into San Antonio, and there's folks just looking at it as, well, we've got the population centers, you got the industrial base, ag comes third if you look at the hierarchy on how we look at water. And that's my biggest concern, to be honest with you, Drew, is the legislature to control the temptation to come out and take water from the rural areas just for growth. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to be challenged with in the foreseeable future.
Billy?
Can I speak to that? We've seen this come up a lot. All the water conferences talking about funding the state water plan and all the discussions around that, they always like to put the slide up that agriculture uses 60% of the water statewide. And so Farm Bureau, along with the cattle raisers and several of the other ag groups, we're currently working on an education piece to actually dig down and explain really what agricultural water use is all about. And the first thing is that 70% of it is used west of I-35. And actually predominantly 60% of it is actually in the Ogallala. So if urbanites, people in the urban areas believe that large water use statistic that they see means that there is water available for future growth in Texas, if they're able to take it from agriculture, they're going to find out that that's not the case. That 70% of that water is being used in far west Texas, where at over $1 million a mile to build a pipeline, it is not going to be cost effective to go to the Ogallala and get water for Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, any of the major urban areas. Not only that, 80% of that water that's being used for irrigation is groundwater. It's not publicly owned, state-owned, whatever you want to call it, surface water. The other over 1 million acre feet that's being used is in the Rio Grande Valley. And with the growth in the valley, I'm pretty sure they want to keep it there. They're not wanting to send it anywhere else. So we know we've got to get over this whole ag's the biggest water user and actually explain to people in the urban areas that if you think that the quick fix is we're going to convert ag water to municipal use, that's not going to get you taken care of under your 50-year water plan. It's just not going to happen because it's not being used anywhere near you, and it's not state-owned surface water that's really being used. It's water that's being pumped by that farmer through a well that they paid to drill through their center pivot system. That's the water that's being used for agriculture. Most of it in the Ogallala, where if you didn't have irrigated agriculture in the Ogallala, the economy up there would take a huge, huge hit.
T. Boone Pickens bought some land in Roberts County. It was used strictly for agriculture purposes. They're piping that water 170 miles to Amarillo and Lubbock. That is their primary source of water. So you're taking water from the rural areas and you're bringing it in. That's 170 miles. Y'all are building the Hickory Creek deal out here right now. And so you're seeing the growth of the urban areas, whether they're the big cities or the mid-range cities like San Angelo, Amarillo, and Lubbock. They got to have the water. They got the population. He's right. I mean, the attempt to move that water from West Texas to Fort Worth, Dallas, fortunately, that Roberts water, that was the plan. But the Crees of Wilcox right south of San Antonio. San Antonio is going to tap into that water. They've got a desal application right now. They're building a plant. And Billy's right. We've got to go through an education process, and I just hope that the legislators at the urban areas will listen to what he's got to say.
Couple of questions on Jim. Get away, Jim. This is too good. Couple of, we can delay eating just a little bit. Any questions? Come on up, Judge.
Darby, you like coming in.
I did.
I really appreciate, I'm Jerry Bearden, I'm County Judge in Mason County. I'm not Alan Amos from Concho County, but I'm representing him today. Representative Larson, I really like your comments about what you were talking about, urban versus rural areas. And I'm not here to pick a fight with San Angelo, but I am the Hickory Underground Water District, and I also work and a member of the Region F Water Group. We know we got a problem coming, and I'm glad to see that the legislature is looking to address this problem. I gave you the quote that was in the paper last week by a couple of city council members here in San Angelo. They're a little worried about the Hickory aquifer because they might pull it down. Another one says, but it's a huge aquifer. We have 37,000 acre feet allocated to us. It's going to take us years to try to drain that thing. Well, you don't think that doesn't worry us? I got 4 phone calls on that this morning already. Now, I would like to direct my question to the lady representing the TCEQ. You're talking about your 2 water masters. I gave testimony a month or so ago to water master program down in Gillespie County, Fredericksburg. We had one in San Saba, several other places. Y'all gave us your cost estimates, everything else. I happen to have my family, we have a mile of the San Saba River over Menard County, so we irrigate out of it. When you're looking at imposing a 3rd water master on the Colorado River Basin, you received many resolutions from commissioners' courts, from Sterling County all the way to Mason County, cities, Goldthwaite, San Saba, everywhere else. Yet we still hear that regardless of what we have put into you and the request that we have asked you to ignore this water master program, we're going to get it because of DNL users that come in here and have 5 acres over here, and they've got, or 10 acres, and he's got 5 cows, which is 22 mini grew up here in our country, and he doesn't have DNL water because the guy down here is trying to irrigate his alfalfa patch. What is the status of this water master program right now?
Thank you for the question. We did do a number of stakeholder meetings in the area to get feedback on whether a water master needed to be created or not in the Colorado and as well as Nebraska. And that was a result of some direction we got from the legislature in the last sunset with our sunset bill. And so you're absolutely right. We got a lot of comments that were in opposition to a water master. We did get some also that were in favor of one, and so
yes, I believe in Fredericksburg there were 60 against and 2 for.
Right, it was a number. It was several hundred.
I was counting on my fingers.
And there were a number of county resolutions as well, and then again a few that said that they were interested in a water master. But what the status is, we plan to have a work session with the commissioners on September 14th. To talk about the feedback that we got when we actually went out and talked with the stakeholders, and folks submitted written comments to us and on both sides of the issue. And so we're going to have that discussion with the commissioners on the 14th.
Okay, and you will let us know about this, because I think when we were talking about I know working with the Texas property rights people and everything else, we still say in Texas that the landowner is the best steward of that land and water.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you.
Just briefly, I'd like to give everybody here a kind of a moment for a closing thought. And again, I apologize. We've got such great committee participants here, I'll urge everyone in this audience, if you've got follow-up questions, please seek these guys and gals out during the lunch and pose your question to them. That's what they're here for. So with that, I'd give everybody an opportunity to briefly just wrap up and tell us what's on your mind the most. Go ahead, just
I guess I'll
jump in.
Sorry, you go ahead.
I was just going to tie into the gentleman's comment there and leave the audience with a thought. We have 142 million acres of privately owned land in Texas, yet in the current water plan, the stewardship of privately owned land is hardly found. There's not much provision for or recognition of the role of stewardship of private lands, and that has to change.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
The alarm went off in 2011, and if we don't respond, that will be the legacy of this legislature and future legislatures. We've got to act. We've got to bring new water to bear, whether it be reuse, water from other states. We've got to get the interbasin transfer issue resolved, but we need to bring new water to bear. Otherwise, we will stop we'll stop bringing jobs to Texas. They're going to go to water-rich states. Our ag will continue to suffer, and then we've got to, but I think that our leadership and the legislature needs to understand this is the most pressing issue that we've got in the 2013 legislative session.
Russ?
You know, I think I'd summarize by saying we need to take a hard look at ways to incentivize conservation through market economics. And let me give you an example. We've talked a lot about agricultural use. We know that there have been a lot of conservation efforts by ag, but just think about urban users funding agricultural conservation in order to make that water available for urban use. That's a win-win for both economies, it seems to me, but we don't have a system in place that allows that to occur. If we looked at market economics and actually incentivized conservation, not necessarily by the individual farmer, but by those that could benefit from the conserved water, I think we'd go a long way to balancing those needs.
Well, I think we've, it's been said, but I think obviously Ag's done a really good job of conserving water across the state, but I think you can only conserve so much. I mean, it's obviously the most economical way to create water at this point, but we've got to, at some point, develop new sources of water. And Ag has to be at the table and will be at the table when that discussion occurs, and it's already started. But I think you're going to see the folks in the Ag world coming to the table and helping those that, like Representative Gooden said, helping those in the cities and in the urban areas and the suburban areas, help them develop those new sources of water and working together. So I think you're going to see a real commitment to make that happen starting this session.
Lance?
Yeah, I see some of you taking notes. If you're with cities, you might write this down. The North Texas Municipal Water District. Go to their website if you have a moment. I don't know the site off the top of my head, but if you'll just Google that, on their homepage on the left side, there's a section called Publications, and there's a conservation plan that was intended for use by North Texas, but obviously it would apply to just about anywhere. And I think if you're with a city and you're making plans, that you'd find that helpful if you have a moment to check that out, and it could apply to any city.
Kudos, too, to Lyle and City of San Antonio, SAWS. They are the primary example of what conservation can do. And I know back when I was on the city council back 1999, 2000, we were looking at SAWS on how we could reduce our per user amounts, and we strive to attain the goals of SAWS. So thank you for that. Anybody else? L'Oreal?
Just that at TCEQ, we're here to help. We understand that it's still very, very dry conditions. So if ag or irrigation or municipalities or industry has some concerns or needs some help or has some creative ideas, just give us a call and we'll do our best to try to help you.
Yeah, that old adage, we're from the government, we're here to help. I think she means that. I think she means that. Thank you again. Let's give a warm praise for our panel.